For this last section concerning the relationship between social connections and happiness, we're going to dive deep into a process that helps us know others. What is it that makes us understand each other, connect with each other, and communicate in an effective and knowledgeable way? And the topic that we're going to use to understand that is empathy. Empathy has a few different ways that it gets defined in popular culture, but I'm going to define it in a way that is consistent with biology, with scientific research that looks at what happens when people encounter others and relate to the expressions and behaviors of others. So the first part of empathy has to do with being moved by others, having a physical response when we're in the presence of others. Some of the other words that get sort of thrown around or introduced in this space are fellow feeling, or emotion contagion, or simulation, imitation, resonance, and finally mirroring. The reason that we think that we have mechanisms to really sort of absorb and recreate the experiences or the behaviors of others comes initially from observations of infants. So if you've ever been around a very young infant, you might have had the experience where you sort of stick out your tongue at them and they stick their tongue back out at you, or you open your mouth wide and they open their mouth wide out at you. And the suggestion from that body of research is that the infants are equipped with biological mechanisms that don't rely on some kind of knowledge or some expectation or some social understanding, but simply a facility to imitate what it is that they're seeing in that moment. Turns out that adults do something kind of similar to this. If you look really closely or very slow down time and watch what people's faces do, when they're looking at expressions, emotional expressions of others, they tend to spontaneously mimic the facial expressions that they see. This happens in young kids, and as we get older, we sort of abide by some what we call display rules, which tell us, well, it's kind of weird to mimic the faces of all the people that we're talking to on a day-to-day basis. But again, close looking, and this is some work done by Dacher and Paul Ekman, one of the pioneers in studying emotion expression, have been able to discover that in fact people do mimic very slightly emotional expressions. Another fun finding in that vein comes from a researcher, Dr. Ramachandran, who has shown that when you block one's ability to mimic a facial expression of somebody who's in front of them by having them, say, bite on a pencil so they can't use their facial muscles in a spontaneous way, they're not as good at recognizing the expressions that they see. So all of this goes to suggest that our mimicry of others, our mechanisms dedicated to mimicking what we see in other people, help us learn and understand what it is that other people are doing and feeling. Another part of this research comes from looking at the body. So if you have somebody wired up and you're measuring what their heart's doing or how much they're sweating, there are many studies which show that observing somebody else's emotions, particularly things like fear, elicits a physical response, sort of like fear in the observer. This shouldn't be terribly surprising, right? You like to go see scary movies, right? Or some of us do. Perhaps you like to go see amusing movies. Perhaps you've walked into a room where a lot of people are hysterically laughing and you spontaneously begin to laugh also. A lot of these kinds of experiences have to do with our basic and very biologically endowed capacity to simulate, feel, and experience what it is we see in other people. One of the pioneering studies in the space of empathy came from Italian researchers, and the reason why it's pioneering and in the space of empathy is because they came up with the term quote-unquote mirror neurons. And maybe you've heard of mirror neurons, but here's as much as we really know about mirror neurons. If you take a primate and you're teaching it how to move its arm in a particular sequence of motions in order to earn an award of some sort, and you measure the neurons in their motor cortex and their sort of premotor cortex, at the time that they're doing these things, you'll see a systematic pattern of neural activation that supports that movement. Well, it turns out what Rizzolatti and his colleagues discovered accidentally was that when they were still measuring these primates' motor and premotor neurons, while the monkey was watching, not actually doing anything, but watching the teacher, in that case the human, who was sort of saying, oh, well, if you reach over here and get here and open this latch, then you'll get the award. Turns out that the monkey motor and premotor neurons were firing just by watching. And this effect has been discovered in human motor and premotor neurons also. So again, we have a real clear story to suggest that at least at a motor level, we're very wired to be able to represent the motions, the actions that we see other people displaying, which makes it easier and faster for us to demonstrate those same actions. Think of taking a yoga class or a dance class. If you had to do this with the teacher simply explaining step by step verbally what to do, it would be much more challenging than it is when a teacher actually demonstrates it physically, and that's precisely because of your mirror neurons that are helping you simulate and represent that motion prior to actually trying to do it. There's still some controversy around whether mirror neurons are also supporting what we might call emotion resonance, and that is me feeling something because I see you expressing it. They're probably involved in facial mimicry, but are they involved in me feeling sad when I see that you're sad? That's a question. Stay tuned. When we think about empathy conceptually, I've gone through a little summary of what we might call affective empathy. And that is this ability to simulate other people's states, right? To have a physical response to other people. I like to think of it as sort of crowdsourced emotion. There's another whole realm of empathy, which is called cognitive empathy. And cognitive empathy, which relies on altogether different biological mechanisms, a different part of the brain, has to do with understanding other people's emotional states. Not feeling them, but understanding them, right? Having an idea that, oh, that configuration of facial muscles plus what I see going on in the world equals jealousy, right? I understand jealousy is a consequence of inequity and not having enough of the things that you want or something going away and a particular configuration of the face. So cognitive empathy is also called theory of mind, or being able to take someone's perspective, or putting yourself in the shoes of another person. So when we look at what happens in the brain, when people are viewing images of other people in pain, what we see is a specific set of structures that systematically represent that state of being moved by that. So the activation is typically in the anterior insula and the medial prefrontal cortices. And the insula is important for representing visceral activation. So once again, your sadness or your pain or your suffering causes me to get aroused. Something happens in my body in response to that. And my midline activation is typically implicated in sort of being concerned or trying to understand what that means. Like, what is it to me? What does this feeling that I'm having in my body usually mean? And those are the mechanisms that are involved in affective empathy. Cognitive empathy involves a wider range of structures distributed around the cerebral cortex, and they're involved in visual expertise, in, again, self-referential knowledge. What does this particular moment mean related to my memories about the world or my historic knowledge? So there's separate structures, separate systems that are involved in these two different ways that we can learn to know other people. Two of the early conceptual thinkers in this space of empathy are Dan Batson and Nancy Eisenberg. Now, what Batson and Eisenberg did was really try to understand the relationship between empathy and well-being, and they were able to differentiate something called empathic concern from something called empathic distress. And what it turns out is that empathic concern is associated with all kinds of benefits. People who experience empathic concern are more likely to help, they're better at regulating their own emotions, they're more stable and socially functional in life. Whereas people who experience empathic distress have other issues and struggles that we can flesh out in later weeks. The interesting thing about this particular the body of work is that it anticipates our next week of material, which will be about compassion. And compassion is really what elevates empathy from the potential for empathic distress. And again, we'll discuss that next week. What I'd like to turn to now is, does empathy make you happier? Can being a more empathic person lead to increases in happiness? I'd like to argue that yes, if you are more empathic, you're more capable of sharing joy. You're more capable of experiencing pleasure in a collective way. There's neuroscientific studies that show that when people play games together and earn an award, there's a greater activation of their dopamine reward circuitry than when they earn that same award on their own. The other advantage is empathic closeness with others leads to deeper and more meaningful social interactions, and the likelihood that others will empathize with your own pain and suffering and support you when you're going through hard times, and that's systematically associated with happiness. I'd like to close with a quote, an illustrative quote by Percy Shelley, a romantic poet. And what Percy Shelley says is, "The great secret of morals is love, or a going out of your own nature and an identification of ourselves with the beautiful which exists in thought, action, or person, not our own. A man to be greatly good must imagine intensely and comprehensively. He must put himself in the place of another and of many others. The pains and pleasures of his species must become his own. The great instrument of moral good is the imagination." And that's just one way to think about the benefits and the promise of empathy for happiness.